verse 32, it says, "And when they heard of the resurrection of the dead, some mocked, some others said, 'We will hear you again on this matter.' So Paul departed from among them. However, some men joined him and believed. Among them, Dionysius, the Areopagite, a woman named Damaris, and others with them." So it's at this point that chapter 18 picks up. And chapter 18, verse 1 says, "After these things, Paul proconsul there. Um, the Jews, with one accord, rose up against Paul and brought him to the judgment seat, saying, "This fellow persuades men to worship God contrary to the law." And when Paul was about to open his mouth, Gallio said to the Jews, "If it were a matter of wrongdoing or wicked crimes, O Jews, there would be a reason why I should bear with you. But if it is a question of words and names and your own law, look to it yourself. For I do not want to be a judge of such matters." So what was he saying that he wanted not to happen in Corinth? He didn't want a revolt of the Jews because that would get back to Caesar. And here Caesar would send his army, his military down there to squash this rebellion. So basically Gallio says, look, this is your own problem. If you don't like what this man is saying about your law, you deal with it yourself. I don't want anything to do with it. So from that point in verse 16, so he drove them all away from the judgment seat. But now here's something that's really interesting. Because who's rising up here now? It's the Jews, right? The Jews are rising up, going to Gallio, and complaining about this. But in verse 17, it says, "Then all the Greeks took Sosthenes, the ruler of the synagogue." So here's the new ruler, Sosthenes. And now it's not going to be the Jews, but it's going to be the Greeks that are going to take him and beat him before the judgment seat. And what that tells me is that the Jews and the Greeks didn't like each other. And here was an opportunity for those Greeks who absolutely thought the Jews were ridiculous to take the ruler of the synagogue if one man will take him out with his beating, bleeding half dead. It's an opportunity to shut them up.
They've probably been emboldened by somebody trying the same trick a few years earlier.
Very possible.
Let's start a riot. We want this guy. We don't want that guy. Hey, finally, if you don't do what we say, give us what we want, you're going to get in trouble. Gallio cut them off before they got a chance.
Right. And the other side of that is there very well could have been some of those Jews that came down there and raised this complaint with Gallio because they had followed Paul from Thessalonica to Berea to Athens, and now we found him down here in Corinth. So maybe we can squash this and we can do this and wait for the rest of the Jews to get here and let's shut him up. But Paul winds up staying there for a year and a half. Longest time he's ever stayed anywhere. So he has a lot of time and effort and his spirit and his heart invested in this group of Christians at Corinth. And I believe it was because Paul saw the need. Paul's been to Ephesus. Paul's been to Troas. He's been to Thessalonica. He's been to Philippi. He's been to Antioch. He's been all up in Asia. You think of all the churches he has helped establish and to go back and preach to them again on his first missionary journey. Places like Derby